What would you do if someone new moved into your neighborhood and their presence made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself? Meet Jimmy Milton, a man in his early 50s, known for his perfectly maintained lawn and his strict standards for the neighborhood. To Jimmy, everything had its place, and everyone should fit in. But one Saturday morning, when a moving truck arrived across the street, Jimmy's peaceful world was about to be shaken. This is the story of how Jimmy's assumptions about others led him to a surprising and unforgettable lesson. Stay tuned as we dive into this tale of judgment, change, and self-discovery. Willow Springs was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other. Peaceful streets lined with perfectly manicured lawns, where order and tradition were cherished. And in the heart of it all was Jimmy Milton, a man who took pride in maintaining the neighborhood's high standards. He was meticulous, always ensuring everything around him stayed just the way it should. But one Saturday morning, as he watered his lawn, something unusual caught his eye. A moving truck pulled up across the street, and Jimmy's curiosity piqued. A new neighbor was moving in. Immediately, a wave of unease washed over him. This wasn't just any move, and Jimmy couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Jimmy Milton wasn't a man who embraced change. His world was orderly, predictable, and any disruption to that routine was something to be wary of. So when he saw the moving truck parked outside the old Miller house, a place that had stood empty for months, a sense of discomfort immediately settled in. But it wasn't just the sight of the truck. No, it was the man who emerged from the sleek black car behind it. A muscular African-American man. Jimmy didn't recognize him, and that alone made him uneasy. He couldn't help but make assumptions, the kind we all sometimes make when something feels out of place. This man, a stranger in his perfectly controlled world, stirred something in Jimmy, something he wasn't proud of. As the movers unloaded boxes and furniture, Jimmy's discomfort grew. He watched from his front window, his eyes narrowing. The man was calm, confident, and organized. Everything Jimmy wasn't expecting. The more Jimmy watched, the more suspicious he became. Why wasn't he greeting the neighbors? Why wasn't he acting like everyone else who moved into Willow Springs? Jimmy couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The man's presence, his confidence, his calmness, seemed to aggravate him even more. It felt like a challenge to the order he had carefully constructed in the neighborhood. In an attempt to ease his anxiety, Jimmy grabbed a pair of binoculars from his dusty shelf and positioned himself behind the curtains. He observed every movement, trying to find a reason to justify his unease. The man spoke to the movers, giving orders, directing them with a quiet authority that only fueled Jimmy's paranoia. After nearly an hour of watching, Jimmy couldn't stand it any longer. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Was this man here to disrupt the peace of Willow Springs? Was he dangerous? In a fit of frustration, Jimmy reached for his phone, dialing the police. His voice was low and cautious as he reported, "Yes, I'd like to report some suspicious activity at the old Miller house. There's a man moving in, and I don't think he belongs here. Might be trouble." The dispatcher, sounding a bit weary, took down the details. "All right, sir. We'll send someone over to check it out," she said. Jimmy felt a strange sense of satisfaction as he set the phone down. He had done his part, he thought. He was protecting his neighborhood. He was making sure only the right kind of people lived here. He settled back into his recliner, convinced that the situation was under control. But little did he know, his assumptions were about to be shattered in a way he least expected. About 20 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of Jimmy's house, the flashing lights cutting through the quiet neighborhood. The officers, Hank Reynolds and Peter McCoy, stepped out, their uniforms crisp and their expressions calm. Both were seasoned patrolmen, used to handling calls from residents like Jimmy, people who often became paranoid over the smallest disruptions. Hank, a burly man with a weathered face, gave Jimmy a polite nod as he approached. Peter, a leaner officer with a sharp gaze, surveyed the area before turning his attention to Jimmy, who was practically beaming with satisfaction. Jimmy had done his part, and now the officers would confirm that his suspicions were justified. "Thanks for coming, fellas," Jimmy greeted them, shaking their hands eagerly. "You know, we don't need strange folks coming in here disturbing our peace." His tone was firm, as if he were doing the whole neighborhood a favor. Hank nodded, not seeming overly concerned. "Sure, Jimmy. So, what's the issue exactly?" he asked, giving him a measured glance. Jimmy gestured toward the house across the street, lowering his voice as if to make his concerns sound more serious. "That man over there," he said, pointing at the muscular figure still directing movers across the street. "Just moved in today. Never seen him before. I've got a gut feeling he's trouble." The officers exchanged a quick glance. Hank raised an eyebrow, looking skeptical. He had dealt with countless calls like this before, where the real issue was nothing more than a person's discomfort with change. Still, they walked across the street with Jimmy trailing behind them, eager to make sure his suspicious neighbor was dealt with. As they approached the house, the man Jimmy had been watching stepped out onto the porch. He looked up, surprised to see the officers, but quickly composed himself. A calm smile spread across his face, and he walked toward them with measured steps, exuding an air of quiet authority. "Good afternoon, officers," he greeted them warmly, his voice steady and inviting. "Can I help you with something?" Hank, taking the lead, nodded politely. "Afternoon, sir. We had a call from a neighbor, just checking in to make sure everything's all right. We understand you just moved in today." The man, still smiling, extended his hand. "Yes, indeed," he replied. "My name's Desmond Mason." He shook Hank's hand firmly, before turning his gaze toward Jimmy, whose face had suddenly drained of color. "I'm actually the new police chief for Willow Springs," Desmond added smoothly, his voice calm and measured. In that moment, Jimmy's assumptions unraveled. His gut feeling about the new neighbor, his instinct to judge based on appearances, was exposed as nothing more than baseless paranoia. Desmond, with his quiet confidence, had just flipped the script entirely. Jimmy stood frozen, completely caught off guard. Peter, looking flustered, blinked in surprise. "You're the police chief?" he asked, trying to process the sudden revelation. Desmond nodded, his smile never fading. "That's right. I'm here to settle in before I officially start on Monday." His tone was steady and assured, and it was clear that he wasn't rattled by the unexpected confrontation. Jimmy, now feeling small and embarrassed, struggled to find his words. All the assumptions, all the suspicion he'd carried with him for hours, seemed foolish now. He mumbled an awkward response, unable to meet Desmond's steady gaze. Desmond, noticing Jimmy's discomfort, maintained his calm. He spoke to Jimmy with a polite but unmistakably authoritative tone. "Mr. Milton, I appreciate your concern for the neighborhood's safety. I want that too, as I'm sure you'll come to see," he said. Then his voice shifted slightly, becoming firmer. "But if there's ever an issue in the future, I'd prefer you speak directly to me. That way, we can avoid unnecessary misunderstandings." Jimmy nodded quickly, his face reddening with embarrassment. The officers, who had initially come to address what seemed like a routine call, now exchanged looks of quiet amusement. They could tell Desmond's calm authority had already done the heavy lifting. Desmond stood there, his calm demeanor never faltering as he addressed Jimmy. His words were measured, but there was an unmistakable firmness to them. "Mr. Milton," he began, his tone polite yet authoritative, "I appreciate your concern for the safety of this neighborhood. It's something we all share, and it's important. But if there's ever a situation in the future, I'd prefer you come to me directly. That way, we can avoid any unnecessary misunderstandings. The subtle reprimand in Desmond's voice was clear, though he never raised it above a calm, controlled pitch. He wasn't angry, but his words carried weight. Respect and trust weren't just concepts that Jimmy could take for granted. They had to go both ways. Desmond wasn't asking for blind trust, but he was asking for fairness and understanding before jumping to conclusions. Jimmy, feeling a sharp sting of embarrassment, nodded quickly, his face flushing red as he struggled to meet Desmond's gaze. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a sense of regret. The harsh truth was staring him in the face. His actions had been rash, driven by assumptions, and completely off base. Desmond gave a small nod, acknowledging the tension in the air before continuing. "I'm looking forward to getting to know all my neighbors," he said, his voice softening. "And I'm confident that together, we can keep Willow Springs the kind of place we're all proud to call home." As Desmond spoke, the officers, Hank and Peter, stood back, quietly observing the interaction. They exchanged knowing glances, understanding the impact of Desmond's words far better than Jimmy could in that moment. Hank, ever the experienced officer, gave a slight grin, watching Jimmy squirm. Peter, a bit leaner but no less perceptive, couldn't help but nod in approval at Desmond's composed handling of the situation. "Chief Mason here has a solid reputation," Hank said with a grin, his voice deep and assured. "We're lucky to have him in Willow Springs. He's the kind of guy who values order and respect, just like all of us." Peter, ever the straight shooter, added, "And I think you'll find, Mr. Milton, that Desmond doesn't just talk the talk. He walks the walk. That's why we're all behind him." Jimmy, still feeling the weight of his earlier assumptions, nodded quickly, the lesson hitting him hard. "Yes, of course," he muttered, trying to salvage some dignity. Desmond's calm authority had done more than just diffuse the situation. It had made a clear point. Respect was a two-way street. If Willow Springs was going to remain the peaceful, close-knit community Jimmy had always believed it to be, it would require more than just maintaining appearances. It required trust, open-mindedness, and a willingness to embrace change, something Jimmy was now beginning to understand. As the officers turned to leave, Hank patted Jimmy on the shoulder in a gesture that was meant to reassure, but also to remind him. "We all want the same thing, Jimmy. It's about unity, understanding, and a little bit of trust." Jimmy, his pride stinging but his mind racing, watched them go. He knew this wasn't just about one new neighbor. It was about how he viewed the world and the people around him. And though it would take time, he promised himself that he would be more thoughtful in the future, more willing to learn before making judgments. Later that night, as Jimmy sat alone in his recliner, the weight of the day's events sank in. He replayed the conversation with Desmond in his mind, the calm authority in the new police chief's voice still echoing in his ears. Jimmy had prided himself on his orderly world, on keeping things just as they were, but now he saw how his assumptions had clouded his judgment. The reality hit him hard. He had let his own prejudices shape how he saw others. His discomfort with change, with something unfamiliar, had led him to judge a man based solely on appearances. In that quiet moment, Jimmy understood that respect didn't come from keeping the status quo. It came from acceptance, from embracing the differences that made each person unique. As he sat there, reflecting on the day, Jimmy made a silent promise to himself. He would be a better neighbor, not just in appearance, but in heart. He would take the time to learn about people, to understand them, before jumping to conclusions. He wasn't perfect, but he was ready to start listening, really listening, and let go of the assumptions that had held him back for so long. This story reminds us that it's easy to judge others based on appearances or assumptions, but that's not how we should approach the world. Change can be uncomfortable, but it's through respect and understanding that we build stronger, more inclusive communities. Jimmy's story is a lesson in recognizing our biases and challenging them. So, the next time you meet someone new, take a moment to get to know them before making any assumptions. Remember, everyone has a story, and often, what we see on the surface doesn't tell the whole picture. Let's all strive to be better neighbors, friends, and individuals by embracing diversity and treating each person with the respect they deserve. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales like this one. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and remember, kindness and understanding can create stronger communities. Let's keep learning from each other and making the world a better place, one step at a time.